you on the show with us today, Mr. Nseko. Now, many, of course, agree that there is scope for a Pan-African airline group going forward, but there is some skepticism because both airlines have not been and are not in the best financial standing right now. Kenya Airways is in the midst of a restructuring plan. SAA is just emerging from bankruptcy protection efforts. So given these realities, I'd like to get your take. What are your thoughts then on the viability of this collaboration?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Uche, and good evening to your viewers today. Yes, interesting development and quite an advancement, and this is happening really fast between South African Airways and Kenya Airways. But what is really driving this generally is a common sense of purpose between the two airlines. There's a lot of history behind them, which is a very similar history, especially in the recent past. Kenya Airways is currently going through, as you said, its own restructuring process. South African Airways has pretty much gone through that as well. These airlines have a sense of trying to reclaim their former glories, and perhaps as well, survival is driving this as well. This is a common thing coming out of the COVID pandemic. COVID is a driver for partnerships in African aviation at all different levels. We've seen all sorts of partnerships come up, interline agreements, code share agreements. And I think this is just progressively the next level of partnerships. And especially for African aviation, I feel like in terms of its maturity, this really is the next step for the maturity of the African aviation industry. We've seen this happen in other areas across the world. And both Kenya Airways and South African Airways have actually spoken about a blueprint from the International Airlines Group in Europe, the IAG Group. And it's what they're trying to copy, which was formed in 2011 between a merger of British Airways and Iberia. So what this really does is it allows all these national airlines, flag carriers, to keep their flags on their tails and their shiny flags and their historical identity. But what it gives them is a shared platform of common services and a pool of resources that they can all share in order to drive down costs, in order to to have a common service that can perhaps lead them to profitability. That's what they're both hoping for. Both of these airlines, remember, have spent more than a decade now without seeing a profit. So perhaps this might be their saving grace. But this is also important for African aviation. And by the way, this really is not something new to the African aviation industry in terms of a multinational airline group. Multinational airlines have actually existed in Africa before. We've had so many East African Airways, we've had Central African Airways, and in fact, a piece of trivia, the largest multinational airline ever created in the world was on the African continent, Air Afrique, which was created in 1961 between 11 African countries from the Yaoundé Treaty. So perhaps some of those airlines from a multinational level were pretty much maybe ahead of their time at the time. But now is the time for us to come together and create these large airline groups. In Europe, to be honest, market concentration is between very few carriers, and that is where you really see the profit. So consolidation, in a sense, is a driver for profitability, and I think this is the way to go.
It's certainly an interesting direction, but let's talk about their strategies, because the airlines have said that the focus is on securing backing from a financial institution rather than an industry partner. What are your thoughts on that strategy? Is it an ideal strategy? Are there a lot of willing investors in the market right now?
Well, in terms of willing investors, that's a very interesting point. First of all, we're coming out of the worst crisis in history. It's not just aviation. So money has had to come by. Generally, the industry has been suffering, but we're talking about two carriers as well that do not exactly inspire confidence from past practices. Perhaps this is a sign that things are starting to change between the two. and willing investors. That is something that will be very interesting. Kenya Airways CEO did point out, as you said as well, that they're not looking to getting an airline partner from abroad, and they're instead trying to find a financial services, a financial group perhaps to come in as a partner. These carriers are intent on creating a hub strategy, perhaps more than 2 hubs, as it has been. They're discussing even a possibility of a West African player coming into play to create 3 big hubs from a very interesting geopolitical point of view from the West, the East, and the South. And I think it will be very interesting to pull resources from that point of view. I think it will definitely be complementary. And in terms of having a partner who is from abroad, definitely, as Alan Klavuka said, it might be a compromise that might not be complementary to them. And I think that's the criteria behind them.
Mm. And of course, we must mention they did say they are also looking towards West Africa for a partner. But let's talk about the overall sector now. You alluded to the fact that we are seeing that push for African airlines to reinvent and redefine their business models as we look towards a recovery. Do you expect to see similar initiatives on the continent going forward?
Ideally, I would say that I hope to see similar initiatives going forward, more than even the expectation for it. I think what COVID has taught us is that partnerships are extremely important. I feel like a section of the African aviation industry has learned this. We've had a wave of partnerships growing, especially in the southern part of the African continent. This is a natural progression for the African continent. But for this as well to fully mature, for the continent to fully mature, I think this can only be complemented by a liberalization of air services on the African continent. So we need to get a little bit more serious as well about opening up our skies and liberalizing air services on the African continent, because we need to have the right regulatory environment to make this sort of partnership thrive as well.
Well, on that note, then, what is your outlook for the aviation sector? And quickly, the African Airlines Association says the African carriers are on a recovery trajectory. They reopened 81% of the international routes. So what is your outlook for the recovery of the sector?
Yeah, the outlook is pretty good. Generally, the aviation industry has bounced back in recent months. It's not just the rest of the world. The world actually traffic grew about 80% in February versus the past year, versus 2021, February 2021. And in Africa, African airlines, expanded by about 70% in terms of their passenger volumes. So the outlook is looking pretty good. I think those numbers also did come before the war in Ukraine started, which will have some form of effect, maybe from an international perspective. It has affected definitely the fuel prices. But in terms of the appetite for travel is only going up. We're seeing international markets. We're seeing even markets in Africa open up. What is encouraging now is that cross-border restrictions are being relaxed. We've seen countries like Kenya, South Africa, and even Ghana open up and lessen the restrictions. If passengers are vaccinated, many of them are not even getting COVID tests now. So these are some of the drivers of the industry's growth or recovery in 2022. And I see that going only upwards as long as we don't get any surprises from COVID perspective.